You must always try to understand people who are not real enemies, who are victims. Most of the young men who are lured by the manosphere are troubled souls. It was easier to get into Harvard if you were a woman or black than if you were a poor white boy. You only need to stay there to realize, where the neo-fascists, the manosphere, the Donald Trumps got their oomph from. When we forgot, as the left, as the progressive side of politics, the fact that it was all meant to be about freedom. It wasn't so much about equality, because equality is very difficult to define. Finger is pointed at the Jew, at the Muslim, at the slightly brown person, at the trans, at the gay, at the woman that doesn't want to stay at home. And you have this coalescence of legitimate grievances with a fascistic, patriarchal narrative. This is not just for us. It goes back to Mussolini, and it transcends the whole gamut of fascist history. Both the feminist movement and the trade unionist movement, or the left-wing movement, was about liberating people from systematic patterns of discrimination and exploitation. The only way of ending these patterns of exploitation is if you actually talk to the people who are being exploited and connect with them.
Yanis Varoufakis, I feel like you don't really need an introduction to Politics, Joe. You've graced us kindly twice before and been, very well received by our audience.
I really enjoyed those 2 times, and I'm very, very glad to be back. So thank you for having me.
Well, no, thank you for coming in. I'm sorry that it's not Ollie Dugmore. You're an economist, an author, and the former Greek finance minister. We're going to talk about the book that's out yesterday, Raise Your Soul. Where does that phrase come from?
It was an expression that my mother used when I was very young, outside the prison where we were visiting her brother, my favorite uncle. And she was preparing me for what I was going to see in there. And from then onwards, she used it on a couple of occasions when my soul needed raising. So when a couple of years ago I started writing that book in response to a certain level of depression in the world we live in, and several electoral defeats that my party suffered, I wasn't planning to write a book, but in order to respond to the depression, I started writing that story of my mom and I outside that prison. And I wasn't even intending it as something that I was going to publish. But then one thing led to another. And I felt that it was a very pertinent story for lifting people's spirits up. At a time of war, genocide, economic stagnation, the rise of the manosphere of fascism. It was a book that evolved into a narrative for the here and now, looking back 100 years through the eyes of 5 women, my mother being one of them.
Let's talk about that tension between your mother and her brother, your favourite uncle. There's this very interesting part in the first opening chapter, actually, where your mother's reflecting on your uncle's, sort of love or admiration for German industry. And he's talking about Siemens, being in Greece, and he's sort of almost welcoming the Nazis or the Nazi invasion because he's looking toward them as this potential growth or potential new dawn for Greece. I mean, can you talk to me a little bit about that and why he felt that way?
You can see it all around us today. You can see the admiration for Elon Musk, the admiration for the machinery of artificial intelligence, of Tesla, of, the all singing, all dancing new technologies, which is totally understandable because it's wonderful machinery. The fact that we have algorithms, as we speak, designing antibiotics that humans cannot design, antibiotics for killing bacteria that are killing people. Yeah, that's a triumph of the human spirit through our engineering. But at the same time, depending on who owns the machinery and what they do with that, those very machines can turn around and create a dystopia for humans. So my uncle was a young lad, a boy, to whom this technology, the Nazi machinery, was essentially symbolizing modernity, progress, the future. A lot of young men, in particular, during the 1920s and 30s, were utterly lured, fascinated by that imagery. and therefore the success of fascism. And we can see this again today. You can see in the way in which Elon Musk is lionized, especially by young men, not so much young women, right? My mother's relationship with her brother was to me an eye-opener. As I was writing the story and remembering it, on the task ahead, and the task must be not to divide, because my mother was perfectly capable of being exceptionally critical of her brother and at the same time loving him and appreciating the fact that at some point that right-wing leaning, engineering, worshipping young man, when he was in his 40s, he put up a magnificent resistance against the fascist dictatorship in our country and nearly died, and that's why he was in prison when we were. So I'm using my mother's perspective. My mother is dead, has been dead for a while now, but her perspective in order to introduce a little bit of nuance in the way that we're looking at technology, divisions, unity, solidarity, what progressive politics should be all about.
That there, the nuance, that's what I was going to ask you about. It's something that I feel is missing actually in today's politics, particularly in the UK. I mean, do you see that we're sort of edging towards or perhaps we're already in a footballification of politics? Do you think that we currently have nuance in our landscape?
Not at all. This is part and parcel of the darkness which is enveloping us, that we have missed out on this, we have lost this capacity to be nuanced. Because the whole point of returning to my mother's perspective and my father's mother's perspective is that those women knew how to be dedicated, committed activists, resistance fighters essentially, while at the same time being nuanced, being able to see in a man, in a misogynistic man, qualities, not being prepared to allow them to sink into their misogyny. So, this is exactly the opposite of the cancel culture. It is, no one should be left behind. So think of the, what was it, 120, 150,000 demonstrators that Tommy Robinson got out not long ago here in Trafalgar Square. What my mother or my grandmothers would have said, which I try to rescue from, my family history and trying to project onto my readers, onto their mindset, is that we shouldn't abandon these people to fascism. We shouldn't just demonize them. Now, what percentage of them are real fascists? 10%, 5%? The rest are people who are angry, people who want to react somehow to a feeling of discontent. And we must not allow the Farages and the Elon Musks of the world and the Tommy Robinsons effectively to grab them and to encase them into a fascist bloc that in the end will rise up and become an unbeatable political force.
Are you saying we should sympathise with them?
Not necessarily sympathise, but you must always try to understand the enemy. You must always try to understand people who are not real enemies, who are victims. Most of the young men who are lured by the manosphere are troubled souls. Now, I know from my own experience, while I was writing this book, I had this magnificent opportunity to reflect on my youth. Now, I grew up in a feminist household. My mother was an active feminist. My father's mother was a member of the Egyptian Feminist Union in the 1920s. So, this was not a typical household. My parents were both on the left. And yet, thinking back to my own socialization, I was socialized at school through misogyny. This is how boys back then, and I'm sure increasingly today, became teenagers, through sharing a language of misogyny, juxtaposing our manliness to the women that we consider to be inferior, or women that we had to objectify so that we could become subjects. And I tell you, as a boy that went through that, this was a very oppressive thing. We need to, feminism, that's what my mom taught me, was not just about liberating women. It was about liberating boys from the manosphere. So if you want to call this sympathizing, maybe empathizing,
I feel like
in order to defeat the patriarchy.
I feel like we've almost lost that. We've almost, the way that feminism is spoken about, I mean, particularly in the last month or so, and this is really being pulled on from America. We're sort of having this American evangelicism imported into the UK, particularly in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk shooting. The prevailing opinion or the prevailing narrative was that Erica Kirk, his wife, was the picture of the anti-feminist. I mean, I don't know if do you really think that feminism can be helpful to men? Or do you think that this narrative, that it's dangerous, is going to win?
Look, I have no idea whether anything good will come out of the human experiment. I hope it does, but my answer to your question is unequivocal. We men need feminism to be saved from patriarchy, because patriarchy destroys our own soul. It diminishes our life prospects. In the same way that, the great German philosopher Hegel made the point that the master can never be free as long as he's compelled to keep the slave his slave, the master-slave dialectic. And I think that, the left had that in the late 19th century. If you look at the philosophical writings of Karl Marx, even there's a segment in Das Kapital in which Marx quite lyrically, poetically, laments the destroyed soul of the capitalist who can't sleep at night because he is terrified that if he doesn't squeeze the living daylights out of the proletarians that work for him, then his business is going to go under because of capitalist competition, and then he will end up being a proletarian, and how capitalism oppresses the capitalist. So liberation should be all about ending the structures into which we are being socialized, structures that repress in the end both the oppressed and the oppressors.
How is that relating to today? I mean, you're looking at the UK and looking at the stagnating economy that a lot of men are currently operating in. How are they being affected?
Well, it is, I remember, let me take first the United States and then come back here. 10 years ago, I was looking at statistics, and it was clear that with positive discrimination, which I supported, and I still support, it was easier to get into Harvard if you were a woman or black than if you were a poor white boy. Mm-hmm. And you only need to stay there to realize, where the neo-fascists, the manosphere, the Donald Trumps got their oomph from. Because the left stopped talking about class. The left stopped talking about exploitation. The left adopted a language of rights, not like every left-winger or justice-inspired political being. For me, justice is very important. But when we forget the class dimension, when we forgot as the left, as the progressive side of politics, the fact that it was all meant to be about freedom. It wasn't so much about equality, because equality is very difficult to define. So what does equality mean? When, if you're disabled, then you need an unequal distribution of resources in order to have a decent life. Both the feminist movement and the trade unions movement, or the left-wing movement, was about liberating people. Not just women, not just blacks, not just whites, but people from systematic patterns of discrimination and exploitation. And the Green Movement was supposed to end the exploitation of nature as well as of humanity. We keep forgetting that. And the only way of ending these patterns of exploitation is if you actually talk to the people who are being exploited and connect with them. So allow me to just give you an example, bringing it to Britain. Britain today, this is a great success of Nigel Farage, is totally consumed by this narrative about migration, especially illegal migration, how the working class in Britain has been hard done by as a result of too many migrants coming. And I remember a few years ago, I was in Doncaster, of all places, and I was giving a talk, and there was this old lady who came to me afterwards, and she said, look, I like you and I like what you've been saying, but, my boy, you're wrong. Because, we've been inundated by foreigners, and I'm not racist at all. I'm an old communist, but this is too much. And I said, well, explain this to me. I said, look, in the block of flats that I live, they're next door to me, in the flat next door, there are these 4 lovely Romanian boys living. Yeah, they're Romanian men in their 20s. And they all share, and they all have jobs, and they all have wages. So the 4 of them in one small apartment, they can outbid any local Doncaster couple when it comes to rent. And that's not right, because the locals can't find anywhere to live. And I said, yeah, of course, this is appalling. But tell me the history of your building. And she said, oh, it used to be council houses, and they were sold out. I said, okay, so now they belong to some company? She said, yes. Well, I said, well, isn't this the problem? Because, what Thatcher did was she totally devastated the working class across Britain by selling off the council houses, financializing the homes, turning social housing into financialized assets, which ensured that the working class in Britain and the middle class and the children of the middle class cannot afford to live anywhere. So the problem is not the Romanian boys. The problem is the privatization process, which led to this situation. And if those boys are expelled, let's say that, Nigel Farage was not big at the time, or as big as he is today. Let's say that we, wave a magic wand and we expel them back to Romania. Okay. A local family will find a flat, but your local economy is going to get even more depressed, because the circular flow of income will ensure that those wages of the Romanian boys are going to be removed. And, so why am I telling you all this? Because this is, I think, the conversation we need to have. If anyone dismissing that old lady as a racist who doesn't deserve to be heard is utterly mistaken. Anybody who goes along with her and says, yeah, the problems are the Romanians, let's get rid of the foreigners, is simply feeding the fascistoid process.
In your story, could you not argue that the Romanians are just sort of making good of the free market? They're just making an intelligent market choice and piling 4 of them into an expensive rent?
I wouldn't do that, because
I was being slightly facetious.
You see, now it's a great gift to Farage, that, because Farage would then say that's why we need constraints on the free market. So he would attack you from the left, that this is a globalist, ultra-libertarian position, a free marketarian position, that somebody like Farage is very smart at countering, utilizing pseudo-left language, anti-market language, in order to stoke the fires of racism.
He is fantastic at using the language.
So we need to be as good and better.
Absolutely. I mean, do you find him... One thing I find very interesting about him, I think it's quite an obvious observation, many people have made this, is that he has pitched himself as an anti-establishment figure, when arguably he is not. He is the product of the establishment. I mean, why is that not bleeding, in your opinion, through to the public? Why do you think he is seen as this outsider who is on the side of the working classes, when arguably, actually, his vested interest is not in them at all?
Well, because the BBC and ITV and The Guardian hate him. So when the political manifestation and cultural manifestation of the establishment vilify Nigel Farage and treat him like a pariah, then that allows him to forge a kind of alliance with the people out there who also feel that the establishment treats them like cattle that lost their market value. But there's nothing new here, and nothing specific to Farage or to Britain. Think of the fascists of the mid-war period. I studied the speeches of Joseph Goebbels, the inventor of propaganda, of Nazi propaganda in particular. And they were very enlightening because that's what they did in the 1920s, in the 1930s. This is what the fascists do today. They adopt an anti-systemic, anti-establishment, almost left-wing language. They talk about the bankers. They talk about, they vilify the bourgeoisie, the globalists, the ruling class, the swamp, as Donald Trump would describe Washington, D.C. or New York City, for that matter. And they look into the eye of the people who are suffering, the people who can't make ends meet, and say, I feel your pain. I feel the way in which you've been treated with contempt. There's carnage happening in our societies. Donald Trump. Nigel Farage is very good. He goes down to the pub, he looks in particularly men's eyes, men who feel absolutely devastated, who feel that they are being treated like vermin by the establishment. And he says, look, they treat me like that too. I understand you, and I'm going to look after you. That was Mussolini. That was Hitler. That was Goebbels. That is Farage. And they say all the right things regarding the manner in which the global ruling class has connived so that the working classes have been deprived of basic dignity and basic capacity to reproduce their daily lives. And he says, give me all the power, and I am going to make you proud again. Mussolini was doing that. And then, of course, the social contract between the fascist and the working class starts building up. The next step is to say to them, but of course, to make things work, we have to be efficient. We can't go through parliaments and all that. So I need absolute authority. I need absolute power. Forget about trade unions. Forget about democratic voice, about deliberation. No, you vest power in me. I will look after you, and I am going to purify the nation, because this is the underbelly of the beast, of the ideological beast. The problem why we've reached that point is because the bourgeoisie, the establishment, have introduced impurities into the nation, and then the finger is pointed at the Jew, at the Muslim, at the slightly brown person, at the trans, at the gay, at the woman that doesn't want to stay at home, and you have this coalescence of legitimate grievances with a fascistic patriarchal narrative. This is not just Farage. It goes back to Mussolini, and it transcends the whole gamut of fascist history.
I've just been at Labour conference, and there has been the sort of rhetoric that I would argue is almost an attempt to outflank Farage. I mean, do you think Starmer will ever be able to compete with what you've just been talking about there?
Absolutely not. Look, ever since Starmer inherited the leadership of the Labour Party from Jeremy, he spectacularly failed to mount an ethical critique of Farage's neo-fascism. And until very, very recently, he has been selling himself, that's Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, as more efficient than Farage or the Tories at making the life of wretched refugees more wretched than it was. That, he can do it more efficiently with a lighter touch. So he's selling racism light, not realizing, the utter fool that he is, that that only warms the seat of 10 Downing Street for Farage, because, people that are told that racism is all right will go for the full fat version, not the light version.
But speaking of warming the seat of Downing Street for Nigel Farage, we've got Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana attempting to put together this movement, bringing back together the trade unions that you spoke of as being important in order, for people to have, to feel some sort of place in society. Let's sort of leave the politics of what on earth is going on with your party at the moment. But do you think that sort of trade union movement would be the way to bring back these men who are currently lost to the patriarchy?
It is necessary, but not sufficient, because trade unions have themselves lost their capacity to talk to people out there who are increasingly not part of the proletariat, but they are part of a precariat. And the precariat has no connection with the trade unions movement, courtesy of being the precariat, of being precariously employed. So that's why your party has a duty to itself to approach trade unions, but also through a younger demographic that is more connected to the precariat, the people who are working for Deliveroo, people who are working in warehouses wearing these little tablets that are networked with the algorithm of the company, knowing exactly where they are, how long they spend in the toilet, whom they have been talking to while having a coffee break. It's important to branch out away from the old laborist traditions of the Labour Party.
So to break down those structures?
To bring different demographics into the party that the left, hopefully, will manage to put together once they get their act together.
In getting that act together, how important do you think our relationship is with the United States? I mean, many, I would say, prominent theorists suggest that we are a vassal state for America. Do you think, as part of a new left movement, do you think there should be a break from America?
Well, it depends on what you mean, America.
I think in terms of it, so speaking of it in a corporate sense.
No, I understand. Okay. Look, it's not just Britain that is a vassal of the United States. The whole of Europe is, especially the European Union. There is this illusion that the European Union somehow is a bulwark against the power and the hegemony of the United States. That is not true at all. The European Union was a creation of the United States. You can see that now. You have President Trump now in the White House treating the Europeans like scum. And the Europeans are all rushing to Washington to lick his boots because Europe is utterly dependent. I mean, European capitalism, including British capitalism, are total vassals of, and always have been. This is not new. So when you say that we are referring to leftists who say that there should be a break with America, well, what there should be, that break should be a break with a dependency on American financialized capital. But not with America, because unless we maintain our links with our comrades in the United States, unless there is, the bankers are internationalists, the fascists are internationalists, the radical centrists are internationalists. They all get together, they are very good to one another. The only people who have been very good at being internationalists are the left, the trade unions movements, the workers, the representatives of the precariat. We need to be internationalists. That's why some of us are putting a lot of effort and a lot of our energies in what we call the Progressive International. Jeremy Corbyn is part of that. We're on the council together. We are forging bonds with the Democratic Socialists of America, with comrades in Latin America, South Africa, now as part of the effort to put together the Hague Group for sanctioning Israel. This internationalism must be what counters the vassalage of the United Kingdom and of Europe vis-a-vis the United States.
So right now we have the wrong type of internationalism. Is that what you're arguing?
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, part of that as well would be, I suppose you could argue, how we have interacted within the Israel-Gaza war. I mean, how much dependency, or how much do you think of our international policy is dependent on what the Americans are doing? When I say us, of course, I mean Britain, but also the EU.
Well, Britain and the EU were complicit in the tragedy which is unfolding now in Palestine, in Israel-Palestine, before the United States became the hegemon. Let's not forget that we Europeans are responsible for centuries of anti-Semitism, of Jewish pogroms, and then with the Balfour Declaration, before the United States became the superpower that now is, essentially the British establishment said, well, we don't want the Jews here anymore, so we're going to give them Palestine, and we will go along with the terra nullius logic, which was the logic by which the British Empire took over Australia, for instance. The British went to the coast of New South Wales, looked at the land, they wanted it, and they declared it to be an empty land. A land without a people for a people without a land, which is a Zionist slogan for Palestine. Now, that's the first step towards genocide, because when there are millions of people there and you say that this is a land without the people, this is the first step towards exterminating them. So it was Europe and the United Kingdom, with the Balfour Declaration, that essentially set the scene for a genocide of the Palestinians, and at the same time cornering the people who were the victims of pogroms for centuries, the Jewish people, into a kind of political ideology of Zionism, which has yielded what we now have. And we have a situation where, anti-Semitism is being fueled. You saw what happened in Manchester yesterday. Because, what is anti-Semitism effectively? It's criticizing Jews just for being Jews and assaulting them. That's the next step. First you criticize them, then you assault them, then you murder them. But there is the flip side of anti-Semitism, and what is that? Expecting Jews to support the war crimes of Israel because Israel claims to be a Jewish state. That's the greatest gift to anti-Semites. So our movement must be, again, I'm harking back to something I was saying earlier, about liberation of Palestinians, liberation of the Jews from all those structures and those political forces which are creating division and, by extension, ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Your book is, much of it is about resistance. It runs as a thread throughout the book. Looking at what happened yesterday in Manchester, there were many calls today for Palestine campaigners to take a step back, to have not campaigned last night. Well,
to be in favor of genocide.
Well, the argument is that they shouldn't have appeared outside Downing Street last night calling for the people who were on the flotilla to Gaza to deliver aid. They were calling for their release.
That is a preposterous demand. You see, as we speak, a friend of mine, somebody that I'm very, very close to, almost a son, his name is David Adler, is languishing in an Israeli prison. He was part of the flotilla, the family boat. He's a Jew. He's a Jewish young man, a political activist from California, and he's languishing in that jail. Am I not going to demonstrate outside Downing Street for his release? Because somehow there is some perverted connection between this and anti-Semitism? It is Netanyahu who is stoking the fires of anti-Semitism by demanding that the rest of the world assume that Jews will be condoning his war crimes, his genocide. Our Jewish comrades are at the forefront of fighting the war crimes of the Israeli state. They are at the forefront of the international campaign because, in 1945, humanity had a moment of truth. We said, never again. What does that mean? It means never again something like what happened yesterday in Manchester. It means never again what's happening every moment in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. It means no more genocide, no more ethnic cleansing, no more orchestrated racism.
So you continue on that resistance then?
Yes,
you don't see these as hate
along with our
marches.
Jewish comrades.
And you don't see these as hate marches, which is...
Of course not. The hatred which is in the air is only bolstered by a genocide. None of us have the right to, not even for 1/100th of a second, lower our guard, stop fighting for the end of war crimes and genocide. And to say that we need to lower our guards in our struggle against genocide in the name of the Jews, who are the people who understand what genocide means more than anyone, that is a preposterous subversion of the truth.
I just want to ask you sort of finally to round off this conversation about Palestine. You're using the word genocide. The UN also uses the term genocide.
It is a genocide, beyond any reasonable doubt.
How do you think that Britain will be perceived in the history books I mean,
There's no such thing as Britain. There's no such thing as America. There's no such thing as France. There are many Britons. There are the wonderful people here in Britain who are demonstrating, many of them Jews, against the genocide. Then there is the Keir Starmer government, which will go down in history as a genocidal government, a genocide supporter. There are people who are demonstrating against what's happening to the Palestinians who are themselves anti-Semites, and they need to be thrown out of the pro-Palestinian movement. So there are many Britons. In the same way, there are many Israels. One of my best friends is named Ofer Kasif. He's a member of the Knesset. We fight together. So what's Israel? I think it's Ofer Kasif.
Okay. I really enjoyed your book, Yanis, but I mean, I've enjoyed every book that you've written. So
Thanks so much.
we'll leave a link below. And I hope if you've listened to this, you'll also enjoy the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.